When we look back on our history as a people, we cannot but thank artists who have spanned centuries past for telling our story in the different art forms that matter. However, African art today has gone from being simply a vehicle of preserving our heritage to becoming a strong force connecting us to the global world. Collectors, home and abroad, are now looking on African art as something to be collected, whether as a hobby, social asset, or investment. For us as Stanbic IBTC Pension Managers, we find this emerging trend exciting. Therefore, in line with our commitment to finding new ways of making dreams possible, we are excited to sponsor this collecting art talk, expertly put together by ArtX Lagos. Tobi Onabolu, who is known for his exceptional work centered on self-decolonization, will be moderating today's conversation as it discusses with legendary collectors and finance guru Olufemi Akinsanya. Femi brings to bear an extensive background in investment banking and private equity, along with decades of experience in collecting traditional art, modern and contemporary art of mostly Nigerian origin. I've heard Femi talk about how he focuses on quality rather than quantity, and yet his collection boasts over 1,000 artwork, which really makes me wonder what number he would have focused on if he was talking about quantity only. So today, we'll get some insight into his passion for art and take some leaf from his book on how to deliberately collect art. So thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm looking forward to an engaging conversation. Thank you very much.
A little bit about the panelists or one of the people that will be speaking on this panel, the main focus of this panel, Mr. Olufemi Akinsanya. With an extensive career in the financial sector, Mr. Olufemi Akinsanya is an investment banker, independent financial advisor, and a private equity investor. For many years, up until 2019, he was a guest lecturer on 2 short programs of the Lagos Business School, also known as the Pan-Atlantic University. His interest in African art in particular and generally dates back to his childhood in Ibadan, Nigeria, where he grew up surrounded by indigenous artworks that played a major role in his daily life, culture, and religious rituals. He is an avid art collector. You can look at his art collection at www.femiakinsanyaartcollection.com. He's a supporter of the arts. He loves timeless music, especially opera and classical music, and he loves reading and poetry as well. He's a trustee and concurrently the chairman of the Finance Administration Committee of Muzon, the musical society, where he was a formerly honorary secretary to both the Board of Trustees and then the Board of Governors. He is also a member, vice chairman, and later chairman from 1995 to 2005 of the planning committee of the Muzon Festival. That is the Muzon Annual Festival of the Arts. I suppose I have him to credit for some of my piano playing skills, although they're not very good. Mr. Akinsanya is also a trustee and treasurer of the St. Saviour's School Trust. Tobi Onabolu, and this is a little bit about Tobi Onabolu. Considering the many layers of human identity, Tobi concerns himself with the how. Within the discourse of existence, he explores ways of being well from across the globe. He questions what it means to decolonize the self. That means that he situates his process within West African contexts, inviting considerations on generational trauma healing, family, social network systems, and ultimately the planet. These are parts of his practice, and he looks at them as a gateway to imagining the universally equitable future, or a universally equitable future. His work takes the form of film, contemporary art, writing, and cultural consultancy. Themes of identity, space, time, and spirituality are centered and they draw upon Pan-Africanist theories and philosophies. He holds an MA in African Studies from SOAS with a thesis focused on his great uncle, Chief Tobi Onabolu, widely acknowledged and celebrated as the founding father of African or Nigerian modernism. So it is my greatest honor and pleasure to welcome you both to the stage.
For you, art collecting isn't just about objects. It's not just about the aesthetics, but there's a whole universe around it, if I could sort of phrase it in that way. And so drawing again on your biography, perhaps we could start off in Ibadan as a starting point to sort of this birth of your collecting journey.
Okay, good evening. I spent the first 10 years of my life, I was raised then by my maternal grandmother who lived in Ibadan, and she used to work in the Western Nigeria Public Library. So I think that she was quite a perceptive woman, I would say. And I have been asked a lot of times, where did all this start? And I think that I have to give her credit for probably sporting some kind of interest that I had. And she used to take me to the library even before I started primary school. And some of the things I remember about her that struck me, that she was an unusually perceptive person, because she would stay on the counter. And you know, those days in Ibadan, there was still a decent expatriate community. And most of the people who use the libraries, you know, you find expatriates, and young kids will go there with their parents. And my grandma would listen to some of these conversations, and she would come home and repeat some of those things to me. And I remember that she pointed my attention to some books that struck her. You know, one book that stands out in my memory, for instance, was a book called My Left Foot by Christy Brown, I think it was. This was somebody who was paralyzed, you know, and the mom taught this fellow to read, and I believe he painted, he was Irish, you know, using his left foot, you know, and my grandma told me about this, got me the book, I read it, and many years later, when I went to Mayflower School, and I remember we had a school assembly, and the headmaster said, whoever heard of this one? I was this little boy, and I was the sole hand up in the crowd. Anyway, the story about art is that I think she nurtured my interest in literature, in music, and the arts. And another angle to that story was that she lived in a part of the town that was very traditional. And you would have, I remember some things from there, the annual Egungun festivals, you know, and I was amazed, you know, by the colorful attires, you know, the masks and all that. At the same time, my grandma was a Christian, and I learned very quickly, you know, that there are some things that a good Christian boy was not supposed to own up to. So, but the interest was there. And I started expressing this when I had some freedom back in Mayflower School, where the headmaster believed that you are the master of your own faith and all that. So anyway, that is the Ibadan story. Okay.
No, that's wonderful. And I guess even before we sort of move on to the first pieces that you began to collect, perhaps you could take us to university where you were collecting objects outside of art as well. I think maybe vinyls, books, music. Yeah, perhaps you could share some light on that.
Okay. Yeah, so I think what I took away from that was that I have always had a bent for collecting, because I remember when by the time I finished university, I had albums, you know, vinyl LPs at that time that was probably straight from that screen to here. I had a fairly large collection, and a few of those still survive till today. And I used to read magazines about Hi-Fi magazine, What Hi-Fi it was called. And then I remember ordering a turntable, a JBL or something, you know, and then the one that has a stylus that was diamond, you know, and all of those things, you know. So I guess, you know, so I've always nurtured interest in collecting in one form or the other. And of course, books, you know, I had a big library of James Hadley Chase books, you know, and I read serious books also, you know, so yeah. So
it's amazing.
I'm sorry, my cousins used to tease me and my siblings. Now, when they're playing silly games, I'm always reading my books, and they call me all kinds of funny names. I just ignore them, you know, so. Yeah.
No, it's amazing. And I guess perhaps this is a nice opportunity to sort of look at some of your early collecting and some of the first pieces that sort of came into your collection. And so here we have a sword with sheath from the early 20th century. Perhaps you can talk about, the genesis of collecting traditional art for you.
Okay, as many of you know, traditional art is an art form that many contemporary Nigerians like to distance themselves from, unfortunately. And I think this is coming directly from Western's colonial experience, and then Christian and Islamic evangelism, and where some people were, I would say, with respect, wrongly indoctrinated that all the things that were traditional to us were somewhat pagan and fetish. But in fact, many of those objects were created by artists who went through a formal process of training and apprenticeship. And they made objects for religious rites. They made objects for customary rites, as they made utilitarian objects. So this particular object is called Okpa Olishaoko. Olishaoko is the deity of the farm, and this was made exclusively in a place called Irawo. Okay, I think it must be contemporary Kwara or Kogi or something. But when I see this, I mean, there's a sword in there which is used for ceremonies, and there are all kinds of interesting anecdotes. That, for instance, the deity or the lady who was the priestess, unlike contemporary behavior, when she married, she didn't go to live in her husband's home. She stayed in her father's home, which is a peculiarity. And one of the interesting anecdotes was this, that when the husband went there, if they were going to sleep together and make love, then they had to do it in another room, not where the sword was, and all that. But all these things are fascinating, I think. Well, you look at the beautiful work of art there, just the quality of the beaded work and all of that. But I don't know how many of these things survive, at this time, which I think it's a crying shame. Okay. So.
And you've been incredibly intentional about collecting Nigerian art. I mean, again, perhaps you could shed some more light on why collecting as a Nigerian, why collecting Nigerian art is of particular importance to you.
Okay. My serious collecting was preceded, I would say, by a period of intensive studying, just reading books, just trying to acquire knowledge and all that. And it struck me very quickly, looking through the literature, that there was a very strong suggestion that most of the best examples of some of these artworks of any type were now in Western museums and all that. And given my own background and my experience and all the things I saw as a little boy, I thought that it was a slightly nonsensical, please forgive me, notion. And Nigeria is a very, very big country by any form of description, that even if it was true that they were hunting for these treasures, which they did, it was not possible that they could have removed everything. Okay, that was the first thing. And also in all of that literature reading, I didn't come across any example of any collection of African art that was owned by an African, or not to talk about an African in Africa. Whereas I also know that these works were produced that were predicated on a settled system of patronage, because Africans always patronize the arts. Many of these things were created either the sponsorship of the Oba or king, or some society or an age grade. And there are examples from different cultures in Nigeria. Among the Igbos, for instance, they have, just to give one example, something that they called Ogonachoma. I hope I say that right. And I think it means beauty seeks, the eagle seeks beauty. But I think the point I want to make here is that this Ogonachoma is made, it's commissioned by different age grades, and they dance them at festivals, I think every other 2 years. And it's a competitive festival. And at the end of the festival, they give acknowledgement to the group that had the best carving. And after this year's festival, that one is abandoned, and they are trying to get something for the next festival, that was good. So, and this kind of encouraged. Among the Yorubas, for instance, there is one of our most storied cover is a man called Olowe Ofise, who died in 1938. And Olowe Ofise was a court artist who was actually brought in and resided in the courts of the Anijale of Ise-Ekiti. And this fellow was so famous that he carved for royalty and chiefs within a 60-mile radius, of Ise-Ekiti. And of course, his works are now priceless, quite frankly. And the reason I decided to focus on Nigerian art was that I also saw that Nigeria had a very diverse, probably very diverse art forms of different types all across Nigeria. And I just decided that I am going to focus, I'm here. This is a perishing asset, and whatever can be rescued, so to speak, let me do it. Okay, and so that was my purpose, and besides, I wanted to try and collect artworks that I could access in these contemporary times, because collecting is not, all these great works of the late masters were collected by collectors collecting who lived at that time. So we shouldn't all be focused on getting things from that period. Equally, great artworks are being created as we speak, and those will be the treasures of tomorrow. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So I take it and understand the sense of systems of patronage that exist in our cultures and in our regions that sort of have existed long before colonialism, have existed for centuries. But yet, when we look at sort of when you began collecting, at least, and in Lagos, I remember you spoke of the fact that a lot of the art being sold, being dealt, was being sort of pushed towards expatriates working in sort of international firms. So I guess, how was it and what was it like being maybe one of few Nigerians at the time collecting Nigerian art, traditional art as well? What experience was that?
Okay, well, thank you. I think basically when you collect, inevitably, many collectors are probably, because most people are trying to find the rare, high quality objects. And therefore, there is also a whole body of ecosystem of dealers. In the Western literature, they tend to refer to African who trade art as runners, whereas, their contemporaries in the West are called dealers, okay? So there are all these little nuances, but the important thing is that there are actually a large number of people before this now, the more recent interest in contemporary art, who do nothing but just go around the country collecting artworks. Some of them, most of them, honestly, I hope, but there have also been stories of some of these dealers looting family stores and all that. And what I wanted to do, and the other thing was that where there is value, inevitably there will be faking, and dupes. And I wanted to be sure that I did not end up with things that were controversial, either stolen or that were not authentic. And what I did in my own case was to cultivate a relatively small group of dealers, and many of these people I've dealt with now for upwards of 30 years. And my thinking was that if you dealt with a small group of people, over time, there's a personal relationship. And I was hoping that the likelihood of those people knowing fully, passing on to you something that they knew was not authentic or of dubious provenance was going to be reduced. And you add that to your own eyes and what you know from just seeing examples all over the place. And that is really how I've done it. But just to be sure I answer your question, you are always competing, those days with expatriate collectors, and many of those will go abroad. So I think the tall and short of it is that if you become known as a collector and people know that you are genuine, after some time, as you continue your journey, they will show you some of their better wares, but you're always competing, with other people who want the same thing. Yeah.
No, totally. And I think if we kind of revisit that historical context of which you spoke about, where the Oba or the kings or even the religious sect were the patrons of the artisans and of the artists. You have spoken quite a bit before of this misconception that a lot of us may have of these objects, traditional objects, having solely esoteric value, being used for traditional religion. But I think that's a bit of a misnomer. Perhaps you could shed light on that and share a bit more on the fact on how commissioning has worked in our cultures before.
Okay, well, you know that, first of all, I think that all societies have their own traditional customs and practices, and I think we're all free to adopt new religions. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that we should be proud of our history. I am sure that almost all of us here, our parents, before Christianity or Islam and all that, probably believed in some traditional worship or the other. I mean, in my own extended family, there are Christians there were Muslims, and all of them adopted these new religions. Their own fathers and grandfathers they were not Christians. So I don't think that there is any conflict really for me. But I think that if we do not gravitate towards our own artworks and cultural history, I think we run the risk of losing part of our essence as a people, because art has always been a very powerful way of fostering communal relationships, and many of those artworks were actually built around communal festivities and activities. They have things for initiation. They had things that they used when they danced for the New Yam, for instance, among the Yorubas and the Igbos and maybe even the Hausas. Some of them are used, for sorcery, but some of them were purely utilitarian. I mean, they have many containers that they call kola nut boxes, and, so for me, and I think the point to make here is that these objects, if you look at the literature, and it is nice to study what truly happened. These people would call a carver, who was skilled to create an object for them. This carver carved for babalawos, he carved for a chief. I mean, that was his profession. And they created beautiful objects. And the story is that the ones that are used for religious purposes, after the artist has finished and handed the objects over, then the religious society will go through the rites of initiation, where they imbue that object with the power of their own religion. But also remember that those objects were not made in the Western context of objects for a Western museum to be put on display. They were utilized. And more often than not, even for masquerades, the headdresses, after the ceremony, many of them are discarded and new ones are made. So if you think through that, these are just artistic production. And the fact of the matter is that when you get through this bias as to what was the origin and all that, you will be impressed by the incredible quality of some of these works. And I'm sure many of you have now heard the story, how the masks, of the Jaws and the Calabaris, were the main things that inspired, Matisse and Picasso, and was the seed of Cubism. But we are here, saying, oh, these things are fetish and all that. I mean, I have lived with all these objects for God knows how many years. None of them have said anything to me, so.
Honestly, so I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds like you're revisiting this notion that is so important in so much of the discourse around writing our own history, which I guess nicely leads us on to this publication that you made, Making History, African Collectors and the Canon of African Art, with art historian Sylvester Ogbechi. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the process of putting together this publication and again, the importance of that documentation and literature of our own art making practices.
Okay, thank you. This book was published in 2010, end of 2009, 2010. And I think it was during a period of crisis at the day of the launch. But anyway, the book took 3 years. And as I said, after I started work with Arthur Andersen, every time I started traveling regularly, and every time I traveled after work, I would always make sure that I went to one museum or the other. And again, I mean, I realized that there have been a lot of scholarly publications. I mean, at home, I have a bookshelf of books, this thick, which is purely Nigerian artworks. I'm talking of traditional artworks of different types. I'm talking of scholarly books, not coffee. Okay, so there's a lot of work has been done, many of these things, but they reflect, obviously, the point of view of the people who collected them. This is a digression. For instance, many of those objects are regarded as artists unknown. Okay, yeah, because traditional artists in Africa generally do not sign their works as modern and contemporary artists do. But it did not mean that those artists were unknown. Many of them were very famous and well regarded, you know, and they recognized them by praise songs, you know, of their, you know, I told you about Olowo of Ise, who was a court artist and worked, think of those days, within a 60-mile radius of Ise Ekiti, you know, was what he worked. And there are examples. There's also another example. I'm just trying to give brief examples. Somebody called Nani among the Montol, you know, in northern Nigeria, who was also very famous. And there is documentation that some of people traveled about 4 to 5 miles away from their villages to commission him to make carvings for them. And they would stay there for about a week until he finished, whereas they had carvers in their own place. So there was always a system in place of evaluation of art, innovation, skills, and all that, apart from the fact that many of them had a system of apprenticeship. Now, back to this book. So I kind of thought in the meantime, I had amassed a fairly large number of works. And I thought to myself, I really am interested in finding out whether I am collecting works that look genuine to me, but I wanted to be sure that I was not collecting copies and fakes and all that. And, you know, in this kind of thing, it's not up to you. Scholars validate the work and all that. And as I told you, I was not aware of any documentation of any collection by an African. So I decided the thing to do was to commission this thing. It was an incredibly expensive project, but I was younger then, but I'm happy I did it. You know, it took 3 years. And then it ended up being an African project. It was not meant that way. But one of the things I said was that it had to be at par with any of those books that I have read. It was not going to be a Nigerian book. So I went to 5 Continents edition through Professor Ogbeche in Milan, who is very famous for doing books like this. And I got Professor Ogbeche, who is a professor of African arts at the University of California in Santa Barbara. You know, he edited the book. And then we wanted photographers, you know, to come from the UK, but none of them were willing to come at that time, or from the US. And it was going to be expensive because of gas and all that. And I had met Kelechi Amadiobi at that time, and he wasn't doing this kind of photography, but I know he was a very gifted photographer, and he did all the photography for this book. And so that is the story of that book. And it's been so many years, and of course, this book was submitted for technical review, as is done, you know, in this kind of thing. I held my breath, but thank God there was no disaster from the review. Okay, so.
Many congratulations to Akinsanya, and thank you for producing such an important piece of literature. I guess what's also so fascinating about your collecting and your collection is the fact that the diversity in time periods that it has. And perhaps I can sort of bring up an image of a work by Ndidi Dike here, who's actually in the audience as well.
Right, yeah.
You are so knowledgeable, so passionate about a lot of our traditional arts, but it doesn't end then. You take it through into contemporary artists today. And perhaps you could just tell us a bit more about how you navigate the interest in both eras.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I have lost my interest in both contemporaneously. It's not that as if most people thought I only collect traditional artworks. You know, of course, you know, I mean, I think there's always something novel about somebody who is on the edge or something. But I've always collected both classical artworks and contemporary artworks. And over time, I have formed close relationships with some of the artists that I collect. In fact, in my younger days, we worked very hard. I worked in a little firm. We were small and mighty, you know, so, but we worked extremely hard. But during the weekends, I would spend most of my time going from one artist's studio to the other. So I formed good relationships with many of these artists. And I think that even up to today, I would say that probably 90% of the works I own, I know the artists. I've interacted with them one way or the other. And so I think I'm now in a place where I'm reasonably deliberate about the things I collect. You know, so, but also art is never, you know, you cannot put art in a box. You know, people who have skills and who are innovative, they run across. And artists are storytellers who tell us stories about what they experience, their interpretation of what is happening around them. And they help us to document history, you know, for posterity. You know, so that is the way. And the other thing is that across everything I collect, I am interested. Another objective for me is just my own sense of the aesthetic quality of these objects. You know, I think that they put you in a space that is inspiring and that help you in your career, you know, so.
It's very interesting. And I guess it leads me onto a section now where we might talk about the state of our industry today. I think there's no doubt where we look at the amount of international visitors in town for the season around Lagos, the art season in Lagos, and what's happening on the global stage generally. The eyeballs seem to be on Nigeria, but even the broader African continent as well. And, you know, this wouldn't be the first time that the global art industry has looked at another region outside of sort of Eurocentricity and kind of boomed and busted. If you look at China in the 90s, which busted in the 2000s, the art market there, but also you've even spoken before of the art collecting in the 70s in Nigeria, where there was a bit of a wave and then it busted again. So what are the lessons we can learn maybe from China, maybe from the banking crisis of the 70s around collecting art in a perhaps hasty way?
Okay, thank you very much. I was going to try and skirt around this subject, but you brought it up, so I think we need to deal with it. There is, let me say, a new wave of interest in collecting, which should be encouraged. However, I think that people who truly love art, you know, it's not, as I say, it's not a 100 meters dash. It's like a marathon race. So we need to do these things in a way that is sustainable, okay? And when it is all said and done, if you look at all the artworks that are documented, that we speak about, that we praise to the high heavens, there must be like probably less than 2-3% of all artworks that were created in the same period by their own contemporaries. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that ultimately, like in anything, it is just the finest examples of these works that have true quality that would survive, you know, and I think that passionate art lovers should be focused on that it's a resort to quality. And there is so much variation in artworks that everybody doesn't need to have every artist, you know, in their collection. You know, collecting is not elitist. Many people tend to think it is. History documents the fact that people of all pay grades have collected art, and some of them have come up with incredible artworks. But I think the caution is that a lot of times, okay, and I know our sponsors are in the finance business, as I am myself. Nevertheless, artworks would be an asset class, but it is the artworks that have in very high aesthetic quality and intrinsic value. And therefore, like anything else, these things build up slowly over time, and when, okay, let me put on my hat as a finance person now. When the whole market is betting, on a winner, now the market is not driven by quality, we become a population of speculators, and inevitably there's going to be a bust. Okay, that is really so. And I think this is also applicable to younger artists. And I think gallery owners who are encouraging, because even in this fair, a lot of the prizes are probably above the grade of younger people. Now, however, I bet you there are artworks by students who are currently in art school, some of them who are not in this category, that might be of comparable quality. So that it is just for people to understand that it's a huge market, and everybody, if you are diligent, you will find something of quality, and you build it one piece at a time, so, okay. So yeah, you mentioned about the 70s. I think the story is that, the structural adjustment program was about 1986. And I think what came of that is a liberalization of the economy, and then including licensing of banks. And there were a lot of banks that came up, and many of these banks soon started buying artworks. And just like we've seen in recent times, the prices shot up astronomically. I think that from many of those banks, then there was a time when we had over 100 banks in Nigeria. So people forget. Those banks, many of them are history. Those collections that they had, because a lot of it, with respect, was just plain nonsense, but they were just buying and all that, So everybody should be careful, and we're not going to reinvent anything. There's a lot that has been documented. People need to train themselves, train their ears, follow their own instincts, and learn how to pick good works, and stick with it, over the long term. Yeah. And sorry, just stay within your own budget, so it's not, yeah.
Very apt. I think that, like you're saying, the works that, from an economic perspective, the works that will always appreciate the most will stand the test of time. But when you're going around an art fair, if you're being shown works, how do you tell a good work? How do you tell? What do you look for in a work? Of course, it's totally subjective, but what sticks out for you?
Yeah, indeed, it is subjective. In fact, one definition of collecting that was cited by Ogbeche in this book was that collecting basically is the process of somebody acquiring objects, but of subjective value. Okay, because what is that value? It's only time will tell. Is that the collector buys something that speaks to him, that he can relate to, and more often than not, the collector attributes the value to the work. Okay, but there's also something, which is why I keep talking about scholarship, training your eyes, and this is why a fair like this is useful, where you have top quality galleries, you meet other collectors who are experienced, and it is just that sharing that knowledge, being around, just like in most professions, is that you go there, there's a body of knowledge that they teach you over time, the way of doing something, but more importantly, they hold your hands and you learn over time. It's the same thing. But the Yorubas have something they call ojuinu. It's almost like intuition. Is that you develop your inner eye. And if you've done something long enough, my feeling is that your eyes get better. I remember those days, I used to look at works. It got to a point I had different kinds of magnifying glass, just peering at these works and looking for styles. Because also many of these objects, as I said, the artists had their own innovative styles, but they are working through a body, a structure. That's iconography. I give you an example. Among the Urubus, for instance, they have some objects, and they basically it's a sculpture of a figure, and they have these ivory bangles that they wear, but they always have one on the right hand and two on the left hand. But that's their cultural thing, and it's the same thing that the artists will replicate. But sometimes you see some of these artworks that are clearly fixed, and then they got it wrong because they have no idea that what they represent was predicated on something tangible. Okay, so those are those kind of things, so it's just over time you learn, and then you see pretty works, you go to museums, you get it at some point, so I think, yeah.
I think there's something very pertinent you said there about training your inner eye and beginning to learn these things almost like a profession and thinking about collecting as a profession. I think that's quite an interesting thing to unpack, perhaps. The word patron comes up a lot in the contemporary discourse as well. And what do you see as the role of the patron in our society today? What, if we take it back from the monarchs from before, what does the patron have to do now?
Okay, well, I think first of all, the creative artists, there are people who are creatives and they need to be encouraged. The purpose of the artists in society is that they create an overall environment that encourages other people in different professions to aspire to their best selves. And therefore, if you look throughout history in all societies, the people who have done well in society have always encouraged the arts. A lot of the major museums around the world that we see, the bulk of those collections were things that were gifted to those institutions by people who collected them. And I'm hoping that things like that will happen in this society. But there, people know that there are institutions, those objects are not going to disappear and they are going to be held for posterity. But I think arts patronage is important, because you encourage creativity. And as I said, that even benefits the individual. And as other people have done similar things before us, I think it's a duty that we should continue and try to hand this over to our own children. And I think if you stay in collecting long enough, and if you are lucky to acquire valuable objects, I think it was going to dawn on you at some point that you have ended up with something which was your own passion, but that truly is bigger than you. And then you know that you have become a custodian. And it's a big weight, but that it is something you need to embrace and then just carry it on. And one of the things that I'm interested in doing now, I'm thinking all the time is, I have these artworks in my house. I don't have a lot of friends. I have a website, but that you need to share this thing with people. Many other people can enjoy it. It doesn't diminish my own enjoyment. So if you can, and that is the way we need to think about these things. There are a few collections or few artworks I've seen recently that in this country of incredible quality that you just don't know what exists around here. So we need to find a way of just showing our younger people great examples of works that were created by our own forebears, because those things can inspire people. It can also be something that we can predicate nation building all around Africa, but our governments obviously need to come up to the plate and be more responsible, and usually art is sponsored, by the state, by subventions and all that, but there are also other creative ways. They can give tax incentives, even pronouncements, of government being encouraging and all of that. But for individual patrons, the people in this room, the people who come to this fair, I think they have an important role to play, in just ensuring that it's part of our culture. And the last point I'd like to make is that the world is becoming a global society. And we love, as Africans, to travel to other countries, but I think that I would feel proud now if we too have something tangible and incredible to share with the world. And we need to rise up to that responsibility. As other people share their cultures, they are eager to see what we have. And I think it's collectors who help to assemble and distill, and we can show the world and share with the rest of the world the best of what we are. And I think all of us will be proud of this process. So
certainly. And I think if I can synthesize a bit of what we have discussed today, it's really about the world around collecting the objects and collecting the art. Of course, there is the transactional element behind it, but there's a whole, like we spoke about, the literature and the interests and the research. You are a trustee at Muzon as well. And if I think about art making practices that go beyond perhaps two-dimensional, three-dimensional works, and maybe time-based and installation, conceptual art, performance, which are harder to collect. How does a patron get involved in those elements? Because if we think about it, whilst painters and sculptors are making beautiful work, they are, of course, in dialogue with writers and critics and curators and thinkers, and it's an ecosystem. But the patronage sometimes gets limited to someone that can produce an object that can be transacted. So my question is, how does a patron support these practices that are not obviously collectible?
Okay, well, I think I will put it simply that the patron or the collector should aspire to think beyond what benefits him directly, okay? And that many of these arts, carvings, masks, they were made for masquerade festivals, okay? It's not just the mask, there is the costume, there is the dancing, like for instance, the batad. I mean, I'm Yoruba, so I give a lot of examples of what I have experienced growing up. There is something they call the batad, which is this tapered drum that they beat on both sides. It's a special skill, but it is absolutely incredible. But I don't know, since I left Ibadan, I don't see that. And it would be a shame to let this thing die, so that the art patron, I mean, I try to support art in all its ramifications, where I have the opportunity. Even music, we have good music in Nigeria, what we can do. And, we have a symphony orchestra at Muzon. And one of my own ambitions, as we had a festival that just ended on Sunday, and this orchestra played Fela Anikulapo's What I Know Gets Enemy. And it's now been scored. And I'm pretty sure that the London Symphony Orchestra or the New York Philharmonic can play this music. And it was absolutely beautiful. And this is how we continue. The culture is not static, it's dynamic, and we can apply these things, to contemporary times, dance, costumes, even fashion and all that. It's all part of culture. So people should try, and that is why we created, for instance, this annual festival at Muzon, which is a Muzon, which is not just music, but we have drama, we have poetry, we have dance and all of that. And one of my own hopes, is that that center will become a center for the performing arts, like the Lincoln Center and all that. We can all dream big dreams, but just slowly and steadily work towards making this happen. Yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. I think we'll now take some questions from the audience, and I invite any further questions to come through. My first question here is, what advice would you give to someone who's interested or passionate about collecting traditional or classical art, having in mind that some of these arts are now disappearing quite quickly?
Okay, well, the first one is get involved like yesterday, okay? Because the classical works were created out of a cultural system, which unfortunately is being discontinued. And over time, there are fewer examples of good examples of classical or genuine works that are there. And I think you also need to be careful. There are a lot of copies and outright fakes there, because I think for people who collect African arts, classical African art, just as in modern and contemporary, you want to be sure that it was an artwork that was created by an indigenous carver or artist. I'm talking of classical works now. They were used, for traditional, either religious or social, in a cultural context. So as I said, they were not made to be kept in museums, and many of those things have been abandoned, even by families because of changes in orientation and modern concepts, misguided concepts of what it takes to be modern, so that over time, many of those things will perish. I mean, let me give you an example, for instance, of my own experience. I mentioned Olowe Office. Olowe Office was a very innovative carver, and traditional Yoruba sculpture is low relief, 2D. And he was the one who created carvings, and some of the objects are standing free, about 6 inches from the base of the wood. Okay, he introduced elements of movement and all that into his carving. Now, when we were doing this book, there was a bit of controversy because I think there was a book that was published by Rosalind Adele Walker that had probably 50 works by Olowe. And that was all of them in Western museums, and then maybe 1 or 2 at the museum in Nigeria. And here was this unknown collection in Lagos with about 6 or 7 Olowe works. And they're saying, how is this possible? But the truth of the matter is that, as I said before, that many examples, and Ogbeche, what he tried to do was to try to estimate the amount of works that this guy could have produced in his lifetime. And there was a big gap, between that number of outputs and what is documented in that catalog. And it just stands to reason that many of them would have perished, but that there must still be a handful of them somewhere lying around in Nigeria. And I've also seen a lot of too many fake Olowe works. But I say now that many great museums in the West have 2 or 3 Olowe works. Some of them none, most of them nothing. But I have, 6 authenticated works by this guy. I say it just to underline a point, okay? But that obviously, you have to treasure those works. And I'm sure there are still a few valuable objects that are languishing all over the place, but over time, they will perish, they will disappear, so this person gets involved like tomorrow, and if you need advice, I'll be very happy to share ideas with you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Another question we had here was on emerging artists and younger artists that are looking to get their work collected. What advice do you have to them, to these artists to get their work collected?
I think it's a very straightforward answer. Master your craft and don't be in a rush. Quality, not quantity. It is just, if you create, I've always believed that quality stands out. If you create works of high intrinsic quality, the value will come inevitably. And this is what people really, and also in any case, I said, the population is large. It is only the people who are at the top of their game who are going to emerge and succeed over the long term. So I think it's a very simple answer for me. If I were a young artist, I would work on mastering my craft. I would not have the ambition of being rich overnight. It's not going to be different from any other profession. It's just over time, just painstaking, dogged work, So that's just the key.
Wonderful, Sandra. Thank you. We have a couple of questions which touch on the same theme around how you store your work and the importance of insurance. Perhaps you might be able to educate some of us on how you store and the value and importance of insurance.
Okay, thank you. Well, in my own case, there is a room in the house which I've converted to storage, and I have tried. But the shelving systems we imported from the US is a boltless system. You can assemble this whole rack just using a mallet. No screws, nothing. And I've been knocking. In fact, all of last week I was knocking and rearranging these shelves. That's the first thing. I also have an inventory system. There are many of them, that are now based on the web. I subscribe to something called Art Galleria, and it's like I have an inventory there of all the works, but it's very hard work, because what I have on my own inventory is, at least I think most of my modern and contemporary works are there, not all. The classical work, when we did the book, I actually had a librarian come from the US. I stayed here for 5 weeks, did the original cataloging and all that. But it's been hard keeping up. But as I said, we were trying to do a book that met, because you are like doing something that was not supposed to be possible. So you really need to be sure that you just tick all the boxes and you do everything well. And by the way, I also had a laboratory come out of Milan then to come and take a few samples to try to authenticate and date those works. But I don't do anything like that anymore. But I have this storage, I have the inventory system, and insurance is a whole new game. All I would just say is that it is a new area that Nigerian financial system need to investigate very closely. What exists now, most people, is insurance as part of house and content, but it is not very sustainable, because most house and content, you are paying 3 or 4% of the value of the works. By the time you do that, you're soon going to run out of money. And the truth of the matter is that, God forbid, fire or theft, the artworks, they're there. Nothing is going to happen to them. That's the truth of the matter. And if something happens, it's probably going to be 1% of 100%. So we need to try to, I think it's a challenge, and you can lead this, but we need to have a professional art insurance in Nigeria, that is sustainable. Okay, it doesn't exist at this time. Okay.
Thank you. I have 2 final questions. Thank you for sharing so generously throughout. This one is on intrinsic value, because you had mentioned intrinsic value. What do you see as intrinsic value of an artwork?
I think that when it comes to intrinsic value, for me as a collector, it is a work that I like. It is by an artist that has some credibility, that has the provenance of the work is undisputed. But validation in terms of value is not something that any collector on his own can attribute. Just like in any other thing, there's an ecosystem. And that is why most famous artists, people have done scholarly works on them, because they have created a large enough body of works. People have studied their techniques, and they can tell you, and that is why scholars can look at a work and say, this is not genuine because this is the brush stroke of this person. This is the kind of works he created between this period and that period, and all of that. And all of that has to happen. Now we have fairs like this, help in price making, the auction houses, the leading auction houses, and gallerists, but I don't think any collector on his own can attribute value, and that was why I said in collecting, for the collector, I think it should be a subjective value. And then you just hope that over time that you have picked right, and those objects are what people think, are valuable. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And my final question, I guess it's a personal question that's here. Have there been works that you've had your eye on or admired? Are there any works, 1 or 2 works you could speak on that you greatly covet? That you greatly covet? Are there any works that you really got your eye on at the moment?
Right. That is that I do not have already. Okay. Yeah. I have always a short list of artists I'm interested in, and I think I'm not ashamed to say, really, I have collected mostly works of Nigerian provenance or African, but I am settled in my mind that my interest is Afrocentric. As I said, I have seen a lot of great works. My own mission is to try to project works by African artists and just to insert that into the global ecosystem. And I don't have any apologies to make about that. But having said that, I am now actively interested in including African diaspora artworks in my collection. Okay, when I say African, they could be Nigerian, and there are a few Nigerian artists abroad who are doing incredible things. Many of them are probably out of my pay grade, but the ambition is there nevertheless. Yeah, okay, so yeah.
Wonderful. I mean, I think that's a beautiful place to end. Mr. Akinsanya, I thank you very much, sir, for a beautiful.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.